In a world where monster hunters exist, the weakest were those at the steel level, followed by the copper level. Then came the silver, gold, and platinum levels, and at the top of fame were the legendary Myethal hunters. These brave individuals faced various dangerous creatures, defeated monsters to save villages, and gained recognition and respect for their deeds. Platinum hunters were very rare, with fewer than 20 in the entire world, while Myethal hunters, according to legends, numbered only 3 in the entire galaxy. Our protagonist aspired to be a high-level hunter, but his wish was not for wealth or prestige, which were the main goals of others. What he truly sought was something different. His squad was very weak, and whenever he expressed his desire to accept more dangerous missions, his leader was afraid due to their lack of strength. The she-wolf of his group, for her part, warned that they were not yet prepared for such challenges. At that moment, Maria appeared. A wealthy, spoiled young woman who kept mocking them, insulting their bronze level and bragging about being at the silver level. She continued to mock, even saying that the protagonist, Luen, looked more like a slave than a hunter. The reason was that low-level hunters, like Luen, performed tasks no one wanted to do, such as carrying flour sacks, cleaning stables, or washing clothes. All these tasks were handled by our dear Luen, exhausted from his work in an optical reading chip factory, earning barely 2 or 3 coins a day, enough for survival. At that moment, he decided he could no longer live like this, that he would not spend the rest of his days in a mediocre life. He refused to resign himself to that existence. Then, a young girl appeared, carrying a compass, approaching him with determination, pointing out that he was the right person for something important. Without wasting time, she grabbed his clothes and a smile appeared on her face, asserting that he would be the savior of the universe. Luen, puzzled, thought that this girl must have eaten something bad. But to understand this scene, we need to go back a little in time. Luen's story begins in the real world, in a temple, where he was looking at some demon banners. He thought, somewhat dismissively, that they were probably demon banners, although he wasn't entirely sure. He was holding a baseball bat and feeling motivated because that day he had an important final match to play. Suddenly, he heard someone calling him. It was his master, known as the Double Caterpillar, an elderly man who asked if he would participate in the decisive game. The young man confirmed, and the elder warned him that if he lost, he would have to enter the temple. At that moment, a young woman who also lived in the temple shouted his name. When he turned, he saw her braiding her hair while brushing her teeth. Luen started joking, asking what had forced her to wake up so early, but she only wanted to give him a good luck charm. She handed him a keychain, which he considered ugly, causing the young girl to become upset. Upon closer inspection, Luen couldn't tell if it was a hippo or a dragon. Undoubtedly, it was not a hippo. She said it was some sort of good luck amulet, as if it possessed some special power. Looking at her, it was evident that she had become a bit nervous, but she was trying to stay calm. The boy then assured her that he would take great care of the charm and kept teasing her, asking if she had become shy. Sophia, in response, kicked him in the back, sending him flying away. The old man, from afar, wished them a safe return and added that he supported their victory. Lon, clearly happy, took the bat and smiled confidently, sure that he would win with style. With that, they said goodbye, and the old man made a face, certain that he would be the one to keep the prize. It was the final of the school baseball championship, and Lon was considered the best pitcher in the tournament, facing Luen, the most outstanding batter. Tension was at its peak because it could be the final play. The pitcher prepared himself, and both of them stared intensely. At that moment, he threw the ball with force. The ball looked like a cannon shot, but Lon kept his footing firm and prepared for the hit. With a precise swing, he connected with the ball, sending it towards the pitcher at an impressive speed. The ball flew so high that a child in the stands managed to catch it. That play was special and became memorable as a home run. Everyone went crazy because that student had done something incredible. With a smile, he heard the announcer say he would become a great professional in the future. Night was falling and he headed home. Our protagonist was eager to tell his teacher how the game had gone. But suddenly, he was taken aback, because behind him, Sophia was calling him mockingly, calling him slow and provoking Luen. She claimed he would have to prepare dinner, and he responded by saying that his face was dirty. As he went up the stairs, Sophia mentioned that their game had been broadcast at their school, and the boy, arrogant, asked if there was an attractive girl she could introduce him to. But Sophia replied that she only won thanks to the lucky amulet. Of course, she exclaimed she only won because of that. Angry, she told him she wouldn't give him any more gifts, and he ran off. When he opened the temple door, he informed his teacher that he had arrived. However, he found him lying on the floor, and beside him, someone else. It seemed the old man was lying lifeless, and a very suspicious masked man was nearby. Sophia still hadn't realized that her teacher had fallen, and he might even be dead. Upon entering the room, she froze in horror at the shocking scene. The girl screamed desperately, asking if her teacher was okay. Luan, confused, didn't know whether to flee or try to save her. The man in the hood claimed that the boy had nothing to do with all this, though he soon realized that Luan was quickly approaching. Our protagonist advanced, holding his baseball bat firmly, ready to defend himself. The man looked bored and, shouting, Luan signaled to Sophia to run away, but she, frightened, did not react at all. Then, he shouted with all his might, ordering her to run as fast as possible. Desperate, she fled, saying she would seek help. Luan couldn't understand what that stranger dressed like that was doing in the temple, nor whether his teacher was still alive or had died. However, it was clear that he had to face that intruder. Without hesitation, he attempted to land a powerful blow with his bat. The creature began to use a strange magic, and for a moment, the boy thought he was seeing things. At that instant, the man summoned a crystal in his hands, and Luan was unsure what was really happening. Suddenly, the man vanished in a flash. By the time the boy realized it, the enemy was already very close to him, and in an attempt to dodge, nearly touched him on the chest. At that moment, Luan was surprised to see that the opponent looked exactly like him, with the only difference being his hair color. Confused, he asked, "What the hell is this?" Just as that happened, the dimension seemed to shatter like glass, and he was dragged into a magical portal. Panic overwhelmed him, fearing he was going to die. Strangely enough, he did not feel any different gravity, so he ended up falling to the ground. Looking ahead, he saw a skull with a giant insect, and thought he must be dreaming. Stroking what appeared to be a viscous substance in his hand, he looked back and saw that a giant insect was there. "Sorry, friend, but you're in real trouble." When he looked up, he noticed there weren't just one, but thousands of eggs. One of them, after being touched by him, began to explode. From inside, an awful creature emerged, truly terrifying. Several eggs started cracking open, and the monsters advanced toward him. One of the enemies launched itself onto his arm and bit him. With a scream, Luan pushed the creature away, but he was already contaminated with venom. He then realized he was surrounded, and more creatures were approaching from behind. He decided that, since he had no chance, he would jump into the water. The surface of that water seemed to prevent the insects from approaching, but in reality, it was full of leeches that ended up biting his skin. Therefore, he started swimming toward the other shore, intending to kick the monsters pursuing him. The leeches were also poisonous, and at that moment he began to lose strength. The chain that Sophia had given him had fallen out of his pocket while he was thinking, "What have I done to deserve being in this place?" Then he realized that he still had the lucky amulet around his neck, along with the baseball bat. As he picked up the small creature, he saw that the animal had damaged the top of his head. In that moment, he also remembered Sophia and his teacher. Without a doubt, if it weren't for that man, he wouldn't be in this situation now. But dwelling on it was useless. With determination, he told himself he had to find a way to surface. Leaning on the bat, he stood up with difficulty, not imagining that just behind him was a giant insect. The monster's saliva was dripping onto the wood, and at that moment, Luan realized his situation was worse than ever. The only thing he could do was plunge into the water to clean his clothes and keep going. The creature tried to attack him, but he managed to dodge it, joking that it looked like a giant tick. From a distance, he spotted the entrance to a small cave. Desperate, he started running in that direction. The creature chased him, but he made somersaults trying to reach the crack. With great effort, he managed to slip inside, and since the monster was much larger, it couldn't follow him. However, its sharp claws brushed his legs, almost grabbing him. The boy kept trembling and knew that was way too close. That could have prevented him from having children in the future. The Lely monster didn't play around, and after 2 hours, it disappeared from the area. His arm was turning purple and throbbed with pain. He remembered it was from the bite and looked for new wounds. With no time to lose, he started searching for an exit. But he was feeling weaker and weaker, although inside he saw a light, the same guiding force of his destiny. However, it seemed that a shadow was looming over that light. Luan shouted for help, grateful not to be alone. But when he arrived there, he was surprised. It turned out that the boy hadn't had a minute of peace. The creature he faced was a giant skeleton controlled by an insect. The monster started shouting at him, trying to bite him, but he managed to dodge it. Luan realized that it was actually a parasite controlling that body, and he struck it with his bat. At that moment, the creature broke, and with his last strength, he fought against the monster. Finally, he managed to free himself. But the entity didn't give up and, to avoid being chewed, offered his own arm. The pain was intense, and a cry of agony escaped from his lips. In his desperation, he grabbed a stone and hit the skeleton with all his might, throwing it far away. With the same stone, he began to tear apart the monster until there was nothing left. Our brave protagonist, however, was completely shattered, and his face reflected despair and hopelessness. In front of him, several other monsters arose, and if it was already difficult to face just one, imagining fighting multiple creatures seemed an impossible mission. There was no chance of surviving, and in a flash of despair, he even thought that it would be better to surrender once and for all. With that idea in mind, he started running toward the creatures, feeling that his fate was already sealed. But halfway there, a spark of determination ignited within him, and he decided he couldn't let himself be defeated without a fight. Steadfast, he slammed his forehead into one of the monsters, though he was bitten on the leg in the process. Using his elbow, he managed to crush another enemy. But at the very same moment, another leapt onto him, causing him to fall. Perhaps never before in history had a protagonist been so brutally beaten at the very start. As time passed, more and more monsters arrived, multiplying the threat. At that moment, a flame began to form around him, originating from an object he carried. A small keychain that Elizabeth had given him. It was that tiny figure, a sort of doll, that seemed to come to life, releasing blazing flames. Luan thought he was possibly going crazy when he heard a voice coming from that little doll, and, filled with fear, he asked what was happening. To his astonishment, the doll started transforming into a fire spirit and spoke to him, insisting that he had to hold on to it, as his life was in danger. The voice confirmed that the figure was speaking and that those flames were there to save him. He only needed to touch that flame for everything to change. As he fled desperately, the monsters nearly caught him, but at the last moment, he reached the flame, and a powerful energy began to surge, sending the creatures flying backward. Landed on the ground. He was holding a bat imbued with spiritual powers, and despite his disbelief, he knew something extraordinary was happening. The approaching monster was the perfect opportunity to test that new ability. With a single blow, he cleaved the creature in two, leaving him amazed by his strength. It was as if luck was starting to turn. Until then, the monsters had given him a fight, and on some occasions he had ended up as the victim. But now, he felt more confident and motivated, thinking he could soon return home, but only if he managed to defeat a few more enemies. Breathing heavily, he leaned the bat on the ground, which seemed to vibrate with inner energy. His eyes shining, he swore that he would destroy every monster that stood in his way. At that moment, he began to believe he was a true hero, after defeating several creatures, although that task had exhausted him. Looking at the bat, he wondered what kind of power it possessed, feeling a current of energy run through his whole body, something hard to explain but undeniable. Then, the baseball bat started to change shape, surprising Luan even more. The piece transformed into a gigantic flame in the shape of a dragon, an imposing creature filled with fire. The boy shouted in fear, believing he would be devoured, but to his amazement, the dragon-shaped flame began consuming the defeated monsters. In reality, the flame was devouring the creatures, swallowing them without a trace and returning the bat to its original form, as if the energy powering it was fueling a mighty beast inside. After the flames went out, the boy remarked that the creature now seemed to be made of metal. At that moment, a sharp pang pierced his chest, and several tears of pain fell. The sensation was like poison spreading throughout his body. However, when looking around, he noticed that the flames were healing his wounds. Only then did he realize that he had not only regained his arm but that every part of his body was returning to perfect condition, as if brand new. Although he felt somewhat exhausted, his body had fully recovered. Looking at the baseball bat, he understood that his recovery was thanks to that small bat, and he thanked it for that. However, the pendant he wore remained unresponsive. He had called it a bat, a penguin, and a dragon at different times, but it seemed to have difficulty deciding which name suited it best. After a long journey inside the cave, he began to feel extremely hungry. His eyes caught some mushrooms that glowed softly in the darkness, and he wondered whether he should eat them or not. The appearance of those mushrooms was similar to poisonous ones, but if he didn't consume them, he would die of hunger. Finally, he decided that he preferred to risk poisoning rather than starve, and he ventured to eat the mushrooms, hoping their taste would be unpleasant. To his surprise, he grimaced and admitted that they weren't so bad after all. With a little salt, they even became delicious. Then he began to look for more similar mushrooms in the cave, thinking about feeding himself better. Also, if the thirst grew more intense, he planned to try the water from the nearby lake. As expected, he found no peace, not even for an instant. Suddenly, another monster reappeared, and with the help of the bat, he managed to defeat it easily. He kept wondering what kind of strange power this weapon might have that gave him such an advantage. Days passed, and despite his efforts, he couldn't find a way out of the maze. No matter which direction he took, he always ended up in the same place. Then, Luan began to suspect that perhaps he should return to the spot where he fell, in the insect nest. That repulsive place might be the exit, but there was a problem. There was always a giant monster there, the same one that had escaped by entering a hole. Now, however, he felt that he could face it because he had the strength given by his bat. Although he knew that the situation was desperate, he decided to try. What he truly wanted to know was who that person was who had thrown him into the cave and why they looked so much like him. However, he understood that he would not get any answers if he stayed still. Clenching his fists, he affirmed that he must get out of there at all costs. Without hesitation, he returned once more to the level of the insects. Upon arriving, he accidentally stepped on a bone, whose tense, loud sound immediately shattered the silence of the cave. He knew that would alert the monster, and he began to move forward slowly, cautiously. Then he spotted an opening in the ground, right where he had fallen earlier. He imagined that if he could climb through there, he would be able to return to his master's temple. However, he soon realized that the ground was very slippery. Looking down, he realized he was on top of the same monster, in a position that left him few options for escape. Besides being an unlucky fellow, Luan was also a very slow idiot. At that very moment, a monster attacked him and threw him into the air. He fell to the ground, feeling a tingling sensation all over his body. Meanwhile, the creature remained beneath him, and after a thunderous scream, the giant insect lunged forward in fury. Luan tried to strike the monster's face, but only managed to graze its paw. He saw that the wound he caused was significant, and with a smile, he realized that perhaps he could come out victorious. The monster tried to attack him once more, but Luan dodged the blow, and his eyes even gleamed with determination. He knew it was the perfect moment to counterattack. The creature started howling, having received a strong blow right on its paw, which caused it considerable damage. Holding onto his bat, Luan showed that he had no intention of giving up and ordered another of his friends to approach. Several small creatures tried to attack him, but he eliminated them one by one. However, Amidst the chaos, he was brutally struck in the chest. The assault was so violent that he thought he wouldn't survive. To free himself, he struck the monster's paw with a single move and immediately fell to his knees, aware that he was losing a lot of blood. If the monster tried to attack him again, he would undoubtedly die. The boy was close to surrendering, but then he heard Sophia's voice ordering him to fight until the end. He managed to see her, and she urged him not to give up, telling him that he still had to get up because his master and she were waiting for him. The flames on the bat flared up even more intensely, burning brighter, and Luan managed to grab it once again. At that very moment, the flames began to eliminate all the monsters present. Luan had awakened a new transformation, forming an aura that conveyed his anger toward these mediocre creatures. He decided to eliminate them all by launching his final attack. This would be his most powerful blow, his last effort to destroy the enormous insect. With that strike, he managed to completely annihilate the creature. Exhausted and powerless, Luan fell to the ground, imagining he could return home through the hole he had come in. But his hope was in vain. The bat continued devouring monsters and, in the process, began to feed on the giant insect. At that moment, he realized that every time the bat consumed a creature, he gained more energy. As this energy started flowing through his body, he felt a terrible pain, but his wounds healed and the hole in his chest closed. Although the pain was intense, it was worth it, because now he felt his energy growing and strengthening. He began to climb the hole through which he had fallen until he reached the outside, where he was stunned by the sight of the blazing sun. The climate was extremely hot, and he did not recognize his surroundings. In the distance, he saw an endless desert. The innocent boy even rejoiced, saying that a desert was better than a cave. However, a few hours later, Luan realized how foolish his words were, and that he was feeling an intense thirst that was starting to dehydrate him. There was nothing to eat or drink. Nothing, not even water in sight. He began to long for that cave, but recalling the skeletons sent a shiver through his body. He was trapped, without energy, and completely dehydrated. He collapsed onto the ground, wondering if humanity in that world had disappeared. At that moment, he heard a nearby voice telling him that there was a fallen child on the ground. When he raised his gaze, he saw a fox girl and a man watching him with interest. The young fox asked him to stop crying, as the poor protagonist was sobbing uncontrollably, with his nose blocked by tears. They thought that this boy was very strange, perhaps crying so much that it even made his nose run. The man suggested they sit down and talk a little more. However, the fox insisted that they shouldn't take the boy, as he seemed too whiny. To which the man replied that it was her decision whether to help the boy or not. Until then, the small fox frowned but reluctantly agreed to help the weeping boy, as they were ultimately willing to lend a hand. As night fell, they prepared a hot soup, which seemed to comfort everyone. When Luan smelled it, he started drooling and muttered that he hadn't eaten anything in days. He looked like a hungry animal on the verge of collapse. The girl, surprised, asked how long it had been since he last ate, and the boy said it had been 5 days without any food. Alarmed, the girl said that was very dangerous and he needed to eat as soon as possible. Ares, who had been watching silently, suggested that perhaps his survival was due to the absorption of monsters. The young girl asked him if that was some kind of magic. Then he explained that, in fact, what was happening was not magic but artificial intelligence. The girl looked confused and asked how he could have that explanation, but he found it difficult to clarify. At that moment, the man interrupted to offer her some soup. While the boy was eating, he recounted his whole story, that he had woken up in the strange world with no memory of how he got there, and that he could heal himself after a bat, which he carried with a baseball bat, fed on monsters. The man considered that ability quite rare, but was primarily interested in his capacity to devour the undead. Proudly, he mentioned that he had defeated several skeletons with his bat. The girl found that skill fascinating, and Ares thought that maybe he could use it for good, as it was very useful. He even considered that this power could be employed to defeat someone in particular. When they finished, the man bade them good night and suggested that, if Luan had no fixed destination, he could join them on their journey. Chloe asked what Aries thought about it, but he was very serious, determined to offer that opportunity. Luan smiled and accepted the situation calmly. The little girl, however, got annoyed because she had behaved in a bothersome way. During the trip, the group gathered some cacti to eat later, full of enthusiasm. The girl, with her knowledge, showed that learning in a dry desert required basic understanding. Luan thought she was very adorable, although sometimes she made strange face expressions that made him smile. He even thought of his younger sister, which slightly irritated the fox. Thus, an adventure began alongside these people, learning much about the races of the world they were in. For example, Chloe, who was a creature from Aries, was a powerful warrior. With this entire group, Luan gained knowledge about technology, monsters, and combat techniques. They had been traveling through the desert for weeks, and with a smile on his face, he felt fortunate to have found such a team. He did not know exactly what kind of inhabitants lived there, but he was certain that these people were good. One night, a pendant gifted by Sophia sparkled in his hands, and he thought about it for a moment. Just then, Aries approached him to ask if he was unable to sleep. Luan answered that his mind was full of thoughts, and the warrior asked if he remembered his home. The curiosity about the boy's origin was evident in his words. Aries mentioned that he was already many years old and had never met anyone from another world. Luan explained that the land he came from was very similar to this one, and Aries commented that it must be a very peaceful place there. Luan remembered how cozy his home had been and then asked if Aries knew what baseball was. The man shook his head, and together they faced several adventures, escaping from a formidable monster. During the escape, Luan told Chloe to run ahead and turn back to face the creature. With his bat in hand, he struck the dragon's face, which roared in pain but stayed on the ground. Then, the monster tried to attack the boy, throwing him far away. Chloe yelled, worried about Luan, who fell to the ground coughing blood. The monster, without mercy, attacked them again, and at that moment, Luan thought his end had come. However, the dragon was split in two, and its remains fell to the ground. The one who defeated it was Aries, a warrior who was accumulating a large amount of aura and displayed formidable strength. After ensuring Luan was fine, she asked with concern as her bat still emanated flames and finished devouring the monster. It was the first time both of them witnessed something like that, and they were stunned. After absorbing the monster's energy, Luan's wounds healed completely. Chloe could not hide her amazement and commented that it was incredible. Aries, on her part, remained silent. The protagonist noticed that not only the monster's body had disappeared but also all its mana, leaving no trace. With this discovery, he became convinced that he could harness the power of that boy, as it would be of great importance. Aries contacted Luan to express her interest in having him help with a mission, which left our protagonist somewhat surprised. Later, Chloe insisted that Aries was losing his mind, but in reality he was keeping a serious purpose. What he asked of our hero was to devour the Lich, a creature that was practically immortal, capable of resurrecting every time it was defeated, no matter how many times it fell. Given how powerful this monster was, Chloe showed concern, but Aries assured her that such action would be necessary, although he would not force the boy. She warned that if Luan entered the Lich's dungeon, he would be eliminated, but he, after thinking for a moment, said he would try. This surprised both of them, who expected another answer. Supporting himself with a baseball bat, Luan stated that he would try to devour the Lich with that weapon, which left everyone a bit puzzled. The next day, they shared a hearty breakfast. Aries asked if Luan understood the gravity of that mission. Chloe, with her mouth full, replied that it would be very dangerous, and Aries explained that the boy needed to gain more experience, as he still didn't fully understand how the power worked in that world. With a clean face, Luan admitted that this was true and that before facing the Lich, it would be wise to train a little more to know his own limits. Our hero's concern led him to think about his words, trying to understand exactly what he was referring to. He imagined that perhaps a baseball bat wouldn't be able to devour a being as powerful as the Lich, but, full of enthusiasm, he declared that at least he would try because it wouldn't cause him any harm. Aries advised him to control the power of the bat, though he couldn't do it himself as it reacted autonomously. Everyone remained attentive, wondering if this weapon might unleash the monster seemingly hidden inside. Chloe explained that Luan didn't know how to manage his mana. "What? I also have mana," he replied, surprised. The girl confirmed, "Yes, everyone has mana." Ares said he would try to verify if that energy existed in his body. However, Luan watched him skeptically. The adult touched his shoulder in an attempt to feel if he had mana and closed his eyes to concentrate. At that moment, he sensed dark magic operating within the boy, something even an experienced warrior hadn't recognized before. The presence was so strong that it increased his unease, and he quickly withdrew his hand, surprised by the sensation. "What was that I felt?" Luan asked curiously, wondering whether he had mana or not, and if Ares had discovered something. The warrior, somewhat frightened, confessed that he hadn't learned anything specific, that he hadn't felt anything unusual, but that it could be important. Calmly, Luan said everything was fine, not fully understanding this incomprehensible sensation. It didn't matter whether he had mana or not because he still possessed the power of the staff, although in reality, the man had detected the presence of mana. And yes, it was dark mana. While Luan was talking with Chloe, that man continued to insist that this child was not normal and that he was also very dangerous, even though he himself wasn't clear on it yet. Shortly after, Luan continued training alongside the skeleton, and 3 months had already passed during which his strength and confidence increased noticeably. Every time he defeated a monster, a bat would approach to devour his body, and since then, he felt that his physical strength had become much stronger. At that moment, Chloe called him, and when he turned around, she offered him some bread to eat. After cleaning the plate, she looked very happy to have found such good companions, enjoying many fun moments together. Chloe, who used to joke with him, started to show more friendliness, and over time, they became great friends, while Ares, always very serious, commented that kids nowadays were quite naive. Then, with an expression of intellectual curiosity, he asked if Luan had been practicing the fundamentals he had taught him, with a look of a novice. Then he inquired whether Master Ares was referring to the fundamentals of mana control. The truth was that he didn't perceive any kind of energy in his body. Part 12 of 32. Ares thought that maybe this was due to the fact that the power within him was extremely intense. He even speculated that Luan could be some kind of mage or a similar being. To motivate him, he assured him that he shouldn't be sad because his body was filled with mana. He just needed to learn how to use it. If he managed to control that power someday, he would be invincible. Luan, very happy, exclaimed that his strength was immense. But Chloe, somewhat doubtful, knew that these words were just to make him feel better, and revealed that in reality Luan would not participate in the battle against the Lich. He would only enter the cave after the enemy was defeated, because his power was still very limited, and his role would be to serve as food for the Lich to devour, thus preventing his resurrection. He shrugged and accepted the situation. Then, the man stood up and said they needed to prepare, as they would soon reach the cave in a few days. With a smile, Luan nodded, and they continued their journey. However, those last few days proved to be quite exhausting, and several times they had to set up camp outdoors. The next morning, after walking a long distance, Chloe complained that he felt tired, but Ares laughed and told him to hang on because they were almost there. He claimed that only a few kilometers remained to arrive. With an encouraging expression, the taller of the two began to motivate Chloe, who was starting to develop an appreciation for him because he was very kind. In this way, they traversed several beautiful landscapes until Chloe was awestruck at an entrance, and Ares announced that it was the Lich's tomb. Our hero tensed up, especially since they were in front of one of the world's most powerful monsters' lairs. They began descending a staircase until they reached a large hall. The boy was already starting to get tense, holding the lantern firmly. Ares warned him to stay alert, but Luan, convinced, asked if Ares was afraid of ghosts. Upon mentioning the presence of a specter, Ares decided to look back as a precaution, fearing that something might be following them. At that moment, it seemed that the young man had a sacred mouth, because as soon as he spoke of the ghost, a real one appeared. The scare was so great that he let out a panic scream and reflexively hit the specter with a baseball bat. He started cursing, assuring that the apparition shouldn't have been frightened. As they walked, Ares commented that the power of the bat was impressive, even capable of neutralizing spiritual beings. In the middle of the journey, our protagonist, that is why Ares had taken Luan to devour his body, believing that by consuming it, they could prevent his future resurrection. The weight of the legend, he thought, lay in the fact that only a creature of such magnitude could be devoured, and he still wasn't sure if all monsters could be consumed. As they walked, Ares sensed that the path was leading them straight into a trap. Chloe desperately screamed for them to stop, and at that moment, a magical circle formed behind them, but our hero hadn't noticed. Ares shouted with all his strength, ordering him to run as fast as possible, but it was already too late. Luan fell into a magic portal, and in the blink of an eye, he was teleported to another place. Both realized they had lost their main weapon, and Chloe panicked, shouting for her friend. Without wasting a second, Ares picked up Chloe in his arms and ran away. The young girl asked confused why they were so desperate, and Ares lamented having allowed his companion to fall into the trap, imagining where he might have been trapped. If his instincts were correct, all he could do was run with all his might to save him. The scene shifted to show the protagonist collapsed on the ground. When he got up, he noticed that his head hurt terribly and that he had formed a hole in the earth. He looked up and saw a huge door, which might be the entrance to the Lich's castle. He thought this could be the monster they were chasing. He decided to leave his backpack there so it wouldn't weigh him down, and he thought it would be best to wait outside for Ares. Meanwhile, the skilled warrior was fighting several skeletons, defeating them with dexterity. Chloe asked, "What is happening?" Ares explained that Luan must have stepped into a trap that led the boy directly into the Lich's chamber. If he really fell there, he would undoubtedly be defeated. That's why it's crucial they arrive as soon as possible. At that moment, the boy began to become completely paralyzed with fear, especially because that door suggested an entry directly into the Lich's hall, and the monster was neither small nor peaceful. The kids, sweating cold, admitted they were in a very complicated situation. Fortunately, it seemed the Lich was sleeping, which allowed them to try to observe if there was any other nearby threat. The Lich's chamber was extraordinarily large, so the boy decided to stay still to avoid triggering another trap. Suddenly, his bat started emitting blue flames, and he decided to grab his baseball bat, wondering what was happening. That action finally woke the Lich, who started to rise, causing a violet flame to emerge from his body. The boy, alone in that room, watched as the Lich also wielded a weapon and was so enormous that it looked like a moving building. Meanwhile, Ares was running at full speed, and from the upper floor we started to hear noises, with the boy suggesting that the Lich had already awakened. The protagonist fell to the ground, panicking, as facing that creature was on an entirely different level. A spell began to charge in his hand, which he shot toward Luan. The attack's power was so great that there was no way to dodge it. The only option was to try to deflect the magic, and that was exactly what he did, shouting with all his strength and using his bat to block. Surprisingly, he managed to reflect the energy, causing the power to return against the Lich and trigger an explosion. The gust of wind was intense, and when the dust settled, the monster remained there, though it had been hit. The boy, furious, started calling the Lich an idiot because its defense was useless due to a protective shield that the monster had created. There was no way to defeat a creature of that level. To Luan's misfortune, the Lich looked at him with its little finger, and several tentacles emerged from the ground to trap him. He was immobilized, while Luan watched, saying that he possessed an unusual power and that he needed to be eliminated because of it. The creature claimed that this strength came from his heart, and began to approach. At that moment, the boy realized he was in serious trouble. But suddenly, something cut the Lich's hand, and he turned to see Ares, more than ready to save him. The warrior's sword emitted a black magical energy, and just by looking at this imposing figure, it was clear that he was very powerful. Without hesitation, Ares cut all the tentacles holding the boy, who fell to the ground, safe. They even asked if he was hurt, and then Ares told him to hide to stay safe. With a serious expression, he assured that from that moment on, he would take care of the situation himself. The Lich ended up casting several spells aimed at Ares, all dodged and dangerous. The explosion of those forces made him wonder if Ares was all right. He realized his attack was ineffective, and amid the smoke, a blade appeared. Actually Ares himself, who, before the Lich could react, pierced him at that very moment. Then, the Lich understood he was in trouble because he was up against a very powerful hunter. The monster tried to regenerate quickly, but Ares was not going to give up. The attacker made a hand gesture and began conjuring a new spell, one of the strongest the Lich could cast. The creature, trembling with fear, loudly declared that this was the power of the stars and unleashed a dark spell intended to dominate everything. The monster believes that Ares will not manage to escape, but the warrior receives that energy with impressive strength. A massive explosion shakes everything around, and Ares skillfully endures the impact with admirable resilience, even complaining that the Lich is more powerful than he had imagined. The area is left destroyed, leaving only a trail of destruction that Ares manages to protect thanks to his dexterity. Then, the Lich declares that he will eliminate him with the next strike and mentions that in the past, he always faced that battle alone. But now, he has brought a strange young boy, and he thinks that Ares has used him as a trap to finally end him. However, the Lich states that he is not the only one with a gift and, joining his hands, invokes a technique known as the Whisper of the Void. Note that the Lich observes that this boy always appears only to confront him, and he questions whether Ares could actually be over 100 years old. The Lich has performed a domain expansion, leaving them alone in this confined space. Ares comments that the mage wants to fight him alone in this battle, while the Lich has set this trap to get rid of the boy. But in the corner, the monster watches the boy with the sword, aware that Ares brought him precisely to erase his existence. Meanwhile, the warrior is paralyzed by this expansion, possibly under a mental spell controlling his body, making it very difficult for him to break free. The worst part is that Chloe and Luen are in danger, trapped under that spell. The protagonist has also fallen under the Lich's magic domain, and he is in even greater trouble, as the monster's dark sorcery directly threatens him. Fear takes over as the monster approaches, whispering that it will devour his flesh and powers. The bat looked much larger than the Lich's spell, and the monster there, terrified, even wondered how that creature managed to enter his domain. However, for that being, everything was over. Not understanding what was happening, Ares realized he had broken free from the Lich's mind control, as if the spell had been swallowed. Nervously, he questioned the man about what exactly he had done and how he dared to introduce that strange boy into his palace. Meanwhile, Ares focused his attention on the crystal in the monster's helmet, aware that this was his weak point. Without hesitation, he sliced the Lich in two, hoping that this strategy would work. Fortunately, our hero's bat was also there, and that energy began to devour the Lich's spirit. Ares sensed that it had worked, and when he looked back, he saw that the boy was experiencing intense pain. When he opened his eyes, he asked what the hell had happened. His bat was glowing brightly, but the Lich was a tough opponent, and with his magic, he tried to attack the young man. Ares tried to warn him about what was happening, but all that energy dispersed around the giant. He felt a severe pain and fell to the ground, shouting loudly. However, the bat's magic began to consume the last spark of the dark creature. Ares realized that the boy was absorbing all that ominous magic, and at that moment, he stopped screaming, even though thick smoke was coming from his body. The man ran towards him, asking if he was all right, as a result of absorbing that dark Lich's energy. Just then, Ares sensed that someone had entered the place. He quickly looked to the side and, merely by the expression on the person's face, immediately knew who it was. It was a woman. Soon after, our hero awoke startled, with a deep sense of fear. However, once he realized he was alone, he calmed down, knowing that everyone was safe. He called Ares and Chloe, but soon noticed a backpack and a note on the ground. It was a message from Ares explaining that something urgent had happened and he had to leave. He appreciated the young man's help, as they had defeated the Lich together. But he couldn't understand why they had abandoned him. The scene shifted a few minutes earlier, when Ares had met that woman. She was very elegant, with red hair and a calm expression. She informed him that the Imperial Majesty had summoned him, but the warrior was surprised, as this seemed unexpected. With a smile on his lips, he explained that this was never newsworthy, and that the Majesty didn't need permission to call him. The man was a little angry and, using magic, opened a portal, saying that, having completed his mission, he needed to return immediately. Looking back, he saw our protagonist. Chloe started shouting, asking if Luan was okay. Seeing that woman, she was paralyzed, as she knew her very well. Just by looking at her face, one could tell she was not trustworthy or good. Chloe ran to find Luan and almost hurried to check if he was still breathing. But Ares told her to stay calm, that the boy was fine. He had only been knocked out because he had absorbed the Lich's energy. The elegant woman was waiting there, expecting the young man. Ares mentioned that something was bothering him, but soon decided to set it aside and called Chloe. He asked her to prepare a backpack with food, a map, and a small compass so she wouldn't get lost. She sensed that that boy possessed a sinister power and remembered that Ares had said he absorbed the Lich's energy. That's why she started to laugh and thought that story was fascinating. At that moment, Ares indicated that she should leave, even suggesting that she turn her eyes away from that boy. He was heading toward the portal, and they passed by him with serious expressions. He warned her that it would be better to lose interest in that boy if she wanted a long life. Chloe looked back with sadness, feeling pity for leaving that great man alone. It seemed that the woman had truly shown interest in him. Poor Lanny was left abandoned, while the woman contemplated that she would continue to consider the boy's powers. Then they departed and the portal closed on its own. Ares still insisted they had been very reckless. He even thought that they were actually his friends and started shouting, saying that perhaps he was the only one who considered both of them like family. However, he couldn't remain trapped in that dungeon forever. He even imagined that perhaps they had good reasons for leaving him there. Now that he had helped defeat the Lich, he needed to take the map and leave that place. But the absorption power possessed by that boy was extremely strange. He looked around and noticed the absence of monsters, making a greedy expression and saying that maybe he could search for treasures. Perhaps he would find something valuable worth taking. He managed to obtain an orb with the skull of a cursed elf and also a legendary staff of pain and despair. Many objects had fallen there, but none were useful to him. Finally, he exited the dungeon and headed toward a nearby city. He had never used a map or a compass in practice, so it all felt confusing to him. Surely most of us wouldn't know how to handle it. He frowned, lost in thought, wondering if there really was a city nearby and feeling a certain sadness, as he was now beginning a solitary journey. During his traversing, he encountered other monsters along the way. It had already been 3 months since he had been wandering the desert alone. Without the information he gained from Chloe and Ares, he wouldn't have survived. After walking for a long time, he finally reached a forest. He was finally leaving that arid place. It had been a while since he had seen vegetation, and he began to notice a pleasant floral scent. However, suddenly he heard the roar of an explosion. Looks like I don't get a moment of peace. The scene shows a boy fleeing desperately, frightened by the presence of an imposing winged dragon, a monster that finally strikes him nearby and throws him far away. At that moment, he believed he would die, as the dragon had him completely surrounded. "Please, someone help me," he silently begged. His knight, named Don Roberto, had already been sent to the afterlife. This man's mission was to eliminate some goblins, but along the way, he encountered the beast. The dragon opened its mouth ferociously and let out a powerful roar. Its breath, so strong that it almost took him, nearly wiped them both out. Then his companion appeared to save him. He was surprised, and she, with a spark of humor, asked if they were afraid. She then told him to get up and help the others, but he became furious, reproaching her for not fleeing while he distracted the creature. However, she insisted that she would not leave her companion alone to face a monster. Her friend, named Alyosha, had to hold back tears, aware that he needed to act as a true leader. With his hand on the hilt of his sword, he asked if they had any plan. She replied that, If she had won at any point, Roberto would not be dead. The only thing they could do was fight to the end. Motivated by her words, he assured her that everything was fine. Just then, the beast prepared to strike the girl with its tail, hitting her and throwing her several meters away. It was at that moment he realized how terrifying facing a dragon could be. The young woman endured a severe attack, and from behind, 2 arrows flew, hitting the creature. She recognized that it was Cullis who had shot them, and she was trembling, overwhelmed by fear. Despite her fear, she declared that she could not abandon her companions alone, and that if she was going to die, she would do so alongside them. However, their leader shouted furiously, demanding that she run away and not return. The dragon, ignoring his words, headed straight for the girl. She knew she would be struck, and in her last breath, she asked someone to come to save her, knowing that it was almost impossible. And, against all odds, our hero arrived. With a powerful blow, he managed to strike the dragon's head. The force of the attack surprised everyone, and the enormous beast was left there, motionless, while he held his weapon, emanating a victorious aura. Minutes later, they thanked him for saving their lives. The dragon, finally sent to the beyond, lay on the ground. With some shyness, our protagonist stated that he hadn't done anything extraordinary. What do you think? However, one of the blonde boys enthusiastically took his hand and said that Luen was his savior. Then, he added that they needed to leave quickly and take Alyosha to a safe place because she was very wounded. He even commented that knocking down a dragon with a single blow was a very difficult feat, and in an astonished tone, asked if perhaps he was a high-level hunter. "Are you a platinum-level hunter?" he wondered, revealing the extent of his power. The tall man remained silent, which made those present feel curious. Then, he stated that he didn't know what that meant, leaving everyone surprised. What? How is it that he doesn't know what a hunter is? Oh, should he know? Ultimately, the group leader lifted his companion, placing her on his back, and our hero explained that he came from another world. Scratch his cheek, and he said he understood that this might be hard to believe. However, the leader affirmed that he trusted Luan because he had saved his life. Sis was filled with curiosity and asked if, by any chance, he had been teleported. Although they knew of spells for teleportation, they had no idea about teletransportation to another dimension, right? At that moment, he realized that his situation was very unusual. The leader commented that what the protagonist had done there had impacted them. They had seen how he used his bat to devour the dragon, and moreover mentioned that the weapon started to glow. With an enthusiastic expression, the leader insisted that Luan's power was truly extraordinary. Thus, they began the journey back to the city. The people continued to ask if there were people with powers in his world, and to avoid a lengthy explanation, he simply replied yes. Soon they arrived at the village, and the leader looked pleased because they could now attend to his comrade. This territory was the easternmost part of the Limia kingdom. Seeing it, Luan's eyes filled with tears. The blonde boy asked if, by chance, he didn't like the place, but that was not the case. Luan insisted that he was excited because it had been a long time since he had seen so many people. After heading to a restaurant, he began to eat fried chicken and drink a cold beer. He was very excited, saying that it was the first time in a long while he had tasted something so delicious. He never imagined that his first adult drink would be in another world. The group's leader was named Al, and together with Sis, he had taken the young woman to tend her wounds. He mentioned that Alyosha had suffered serious injuries to her arm, so they would take her to a hospital and later recover Robert's body from a nearby forest. Luan expressed regret that he hadn't arrived in time to save the other teammate, but Al assured him that it didn't matter and handed him a bag of coins so he could get through the day until they met again at the inn that night. He noted that the amount wasn't much, but it would be enough. Then he realized he was in a new world, and of course many of us would long to experience something like that, even if it wasn't as traumatic as his. Looking ahead, he saw that the hall was very crowded, with many races such as beast creatures, dwarves, elves, and humans. However, he hadn't slept comfortably in a long time. The next morning, when he woke up, he was completely exhausted. He had fallen asleep quickly and, for some reason, It seemed he had rested more than usual. At that moment, he heard calls at the door and got up to answer. He realized that the one calling him was exactly Seuss, the beast girl who had recovered along with another girl with violet hair. She looked very adorable and thanked him for what he had done. She also asked him to come downstairs to meet Alt, so our protagonist descended the stairs. When he reached the bottom, the boy insisted that they sit together. The leader of the group was very cordial and told him he could eat as much as he wanted. Alan Lightite wanted to thank him in person, but he felt a bit shy, and Alt mentioned that he would also like to thank him properly for what happened the day before. With a smile, Luen replied that it wasn't necessary. Then, the young man introduced himself, saying his name was Alt and that he was a copper-ranked hunter from the group they were traveling with. The beast's name was Alyosha, while the human member of the rear guard was Celis. Intrigued, Luen asked what this business about hunters and ranks meant, to which Alt was surprised by his lack of knowledge and stated that it was very rude of him not to know, given that he came from another world. The young man explained that hunters were people who hunted wild monsters or dangerous animals for villages. The ranks ranged from the lowest, like steel, followed by copper, silver, gold, platinum, and finally myethal. Lower-level groups hunted weaker creatures, but as one rose in rank, they faced more powerful monsters. Advancing in rank brought recognition and prestige, as fame grew significantly with each promotion. It was said that worldwide, there were only 20 platinum-level hunters, and in all history only 10 had reached the myethal level, of whom only 3 were still alive. Luen understood that these ranks and insignias seemed to carry enormous importance in that society. In fact, they even sold these certifications on the black market. Although forging a rank was a serious crime, many people did it anyway. Luen nodded, acknowledging that all this information was quite a lot to take in. However, Alt changed the subject and suggested that he join their group, which surprised the young man greatly. He clarified that he didn't want to pressure him, but from his perspective, it would be beneficial for him to join since he needed money and would also gain prestige. Reflecting on this, Luen realized that if he wanted to return to his world, he would have to adapt to this environment. The fox girl stated that he was very strong because he had defeated a dragon with a single blow. However, some bystanders who overheard this didn't believe it and started whispering that it was a lie. A young woman slammed her hand on the table and declared that it was impossible to defeat a dragon with just one blow, accusing everyone present of lying. Our hero found that kind of person insufferable. Aloha then told Maria that she should leave because her presence was very annoying, and she continued to mock that animal, saying he shouldn't share food with humans. Finally, the girl left, leaving Alyosha extremely angry, and Alt had to intervene to separate the altercation. The girl continues to provoke our protagonist, ridiculing him for not having enough strength to hunt a dragon, and mockingly asks if he has brought any part of the monster to prove that he indeed defeated it. Alt responds that no, the hero ate the creature, so he has no proof. Unaware, she begins to laugh, calling them liars, and threatens Alt, saying that low-level hunters don't even know how to hunt goblins. Provoked, Luen starts to get irritated, while she despises the commoners and claims that a noble like her should not deal with simple slaves. At that moment, the young woman speaks to him in a defiant tone, calling him stubborn. The blonde, annoyed, protests, saying she is not short. The girl replies that she isn't. She's just about 1.42 meters. At that instant, a red-headed woman appears to intervene and separate the fight. The bulky man asks who that girl is and notes that she seems very calm. Maria tells Brian to stop interrupting her conversation, and the redhead apologizes to the lady, explaining that she needs to stop the fight because she doesn't want a bigger conflict and is trying to calm her down. However, our protagonist taps her shoulder and asks, "Who does that guy think he is to get involved in your affairs?" Brian becomes serious and states firmly, "Let's end this childish fight right now." Sensing that the redhead is very serious, Luen laughs and doubts, "Are you helping me bother myself?" Tension quickly escalates. Luen's gaze fixes on Brian, who suddenly presents himself as a steady figure amidst the dispute. Then, a small dwarf appears, asking everyone to put aside their differences. It is Aaron, who tells Brian to stop acting like a child and seeking fights. He also claims that Maria was the one who started the provocations. Addressing Luen, he apologizes and explains that everyone was surprised by the story of how a dragon was defeated with a single blow, considering it an exaggeration. Luen realizes that the smallest one there is actually the most mature. He looks at his new companions, who seem very calm, and decides that he doesn't want to encounter them in a similar situation again. Eren shows gratitude for his understanding, and thus the fight is decided to be over. Back at the table, Silas laughs and comments that he took those provocations too seriously. Then, he asks his companions what he should do to become a hunter. He wished to join the guild and participate with them in adventures. After completing the registration process, he received an iron badge, recalling that his friend had told him only the registration fee would be necessary. He didn't realize that the cost would be so high. Hours earlier, the friend had assured him it wouldn't be much money, and that perhaps the amount he had paid the day before would be enough. Upon checking his money, he saw that he only had 1 gold coin left. Alt explained that this coin was worth 1,000 crowns, while the black coin was worth 1 crown, the copper 10, the silver 100, and the gold 1,000. Because of this, he thought he was rich and was very glad. However, half of his money remained in the guild registration fee. It seemed that things would be even harder in this world now that he was part of the guild. Everyone told him they had to leave. "What? Already?" exclaimed the blonde girl, indicating that they should prepare for the next mission, which would start in 3 days. Therefore, they needed to get ready. Only 3 days? That's very little time, Alt thought. Maybe he could go buy some equipment. They stayed at an inn where the guild also operated, and most of the guests were hunters. That's why he always met Maria there, and it was also possible to accept quests. Alt explained to Luen that he could take some jobs to gather money and buy better gear. With a smile, the main character promised to do just that. So they said goodbye and he set out to accept quests. He honestly felt a bit nervous, as he thought it would be very difficult to earn enough money. He had already spent 500 crowns on that emblem, and he started to calculate how much he needed to earn each day to survive, given that the room and food were very expensive. It seemed he would have to work hard, and at one point he was moved to tears, feeling unprepared for such a challenge. Later, he went to a store and bought a rather elegant suit of armor, although he couldn't afford a metal one, so he chose leather, which cost 230 crowns. He paid, annoyed, and thought that metal armors should be much more expensive. When he left, he felt a bit disoriented and wondered what he should do next. As his money was also running out, he knew it was time to accept a quest. He entered the guild and, with a firm strike, hit the table where a poster was hanging and expressed his interest in that mission. He even tried to flirt with the person in charge to get assigned that task. However, she told him that his steel level only allowed him to accept low-level missions. With few options, he accepted the first task he found, taking care of a young boy who was carrying sacks of flour. Afterwards, he had to clean a barn and, finally, wash clothes. The situation was humiliating for him, as he was much stronger than most hunters. Every night, he returned home exhausted after a day of hard manual labor. The pay he received for his effort was barely 30 crowns, which was very difficult, since the only food for the day cost 25. On his way, he saw one of the merchants advertising an appetizing skewer of food. He approached, couldn't resist the look of those skewers, and, with great appetite, bought only 3 crowns worth to take with him. When testing, he discovered they were delicious. However, an unexpected presence appeared behind him, reaching out a hand, followed by a young woman who seemed guided by some sort of compass. At that moment, she knew she had found the person she was looking for, our protagonist, who remained there, innocent, enjoying his meal. The young woman approached and touched his dress, saying she had found him. When he turned around, he was stunned to see that she was a beautiful red-haired elf, who claimed that he was the person whose fate was bound to hers. He couldn't understand anything. Then, they both entered an inn, and she continued to insist that he was the destined hero. Seriously, he asked if she had any proof of that, and she replied that it was a prophecy from her master, who had given her that compass to guide her to the hero. He, disbelieving such absurd stories, stated that he could not accept that version without question. The girl insisted, assuring that her master, named Dus, the prophetic which had never been wrong in his predictions. She even cited an occasion when he said it would rain, and indeed it rained that day. But he countered that this was not a true prophecy, as the sky was not cloudy. The young woman visibly became angry. She reproached him for his attitude, asking that if he was the destined hero, what was he meant for? The girl explained that her master had said she needed to help the hero, no matter what he did. However, he questioned with some disbelief if she really knew what she was trying to do. She claimed that he was trying to save the world, but he clarified that his only desire was to return to his original world, since his goal was not to save this reality but to get back home as soon as possible. He wished her luck in her mission and parted ways, leaving the boy alone. From above, Maria watched the scene and, mockingly, imagined that he had been rejected by the young woman. Brian advised her not to worry or interfere in others' lives. But Maria, amused, commented that she found it entertaining to mock the poor, and that he, as the group's leader, should handle the heavy tasks, like dealing with papers. Then she got angry, saying that was exactly her role. Noble people like her shouldn't worry about such things. However, when Brian looked down, he realized that she was a disciple of Dre's, and just by observing the young woman, he already found her interesting, imagining her as a powerful woman. The girl has a memory of her master giving her that compass. He explained that it was a magical tool that would guide her to her destiny, even urging her to leave quickly. In that way, she bid farewell to her mentor before departing. The scene shifts and shows our protagonist performing heavy tasks, exhausted and covered in sweat. An elderly woman thanks him for lifting such heavy sacks, and he responds that he didn't do anything special, just fulfilled his duty. Meanwhile, the young woman watches him from afar. The elderly woman, very happy, offers him a tip, which greatly pleases him. She, in turn, begins to feel uneasy, wondering if Luen really is the destined hero and worried about what he will have to do next. At that moment, he interrupts her, asking if she thinks he has been spying on him all afternoon, and mentions that he has noticed she has been following him. He advises her that it would be better for her to return to her master, as he is not the destined hero she believed him to be. Then, the young woman reveals that her master has already passed away. The man realizes that his words were blunt and apologizes, admitting that he did not mean to offend her. The young woman stands up and asks if his wish is to return to his original world. If that is what he truly wants, she will help him. If he truly wants to clear Barnes, he must do so. But if he wishes to return home, she will stay by his side. Her master taught her that she should assist him in whatever was necessary, and she is fulfilling that instruction. The scene shifts to the Hunters Guild. Alt is fixing his armor when someone calls him. Silas mentions that Luen is also at the inn, but it's strange because they haven't seen him all day. Another person loudly states that he ran away out of fear. At that moment, Maria appears, insisting that this young man is a liar and did not defeat the dragon, as everyone says. Alt asks her why she is provoking him right now, and Maria continues to provoke, asking if they don't know about the reports of monsters appearing around the village. Because of this, his group, the oppressive nobles, accepted the mission to eliminate these creatures and also to oversee and protect novice hunters participating in the hunt. Alt agrees to join the mission but warns he will not tolerate provocations. Veronica, one of his companions, asks who that Luen is. Silas, very loudly, claims that Luen saved their lives by defeating a dragon. Maria, for her part, begins to laugh and says that's ridiculous because in her opinion, Luen seemed very weak. She even mentions that Luen was flirting with an elf, which made the young girl very embarrassed. The blonde girl stated that a wizard had appeared, insisting he was a destined hero or something similar, and then she saw both of them in a full romance, suggesting that he might have abandoned his group to live with that girl. However, Silas appeared there, claiming that that girl was a liar. The jealous girl became very nervous, and even Maria seemed surprised and frightened by the situation. She insisted that Luen would never leave his group without an explanation and asked who that girl behind him was. At that moment, Luen arrived on the scene, and everyone turned to look at him. There was our dear Luen, accompanied by Ariel, the red-haired mage that Maria had mentioned earlier. She greeted everyone kindly. Alt asked where he had been, and our protagonist apologized for his delay, explaining that the mission was about to start. Maria, on her part, looked somewhat disappointed as she had just lied. Pointing a finger at Luen, she claimed that he was a traitor, to which he responded that he hadn't done anything to deserve that accusation. Maria insisted that she considered Luen a traitor for having formed a group with the mage and for abandoning his companions, which she interpreted as treason. Alt explained that he didn't force his friend to act a certain way and that if he wanted to form a group with someone else, there was no problem. Silas, clearly jealous, watched the scene with obvious interest. The mage, Ariel, sat next to them and Alt asked how they had met. Luen, scratching his head, said it was a long story, but Ariel affirmed that she had sought him out and that luck had brought her to Luen, which only worsened the situation, making everyone look like a couple. Of course, Silas became even more jealous. The discussion led to comments from Brian, who jokingly suggested that there was a romantic atmosphere in the air to ease the tension. Then Alt, curious, asked for the young woman's name. She replied that her name was Ariel, and very excitedly, Alt asked if she wanted to join the monster hunting mission, to which she enthusiastically agreed, eager to help Luen wherever needed. Vera and Brian continued commenting that love was beautiful. Due to severe wounds on his arm, Ilyosha couldn't participate in the mission, so it would be wise to include someone else. Luen apologized for bringing the girl without consulting the group leader, but Alt assured him there was no problem and that they should start preparing to depart. The mission would be to hunt goblins, creatures less dangerous than others that acted impulsively and attacked villages in the forest. The group explained that in their recent village in the forest, many goblins had appeared, and the previous week, they had tried to catch them but were attacked by a dragon. They didn't even fully understand what their mission was, but they asked why that other group was following them so closely. Alt explained that there were more powerful monsters and that, for that reason, a stronger squad had been sent to monitor them. Maria kept saying that it should be considered an honor since, as a noble, she was protecting a stranger who was barely at the iron rank. The entire group warned Luen not to pay attention to that girl's provocations and that, although Maria was quite annoying, she was actually very strong for someone still new, having already reached the silver rank and on the verge of advancing to gold. The little girl, very curious, asked where that blonde mage had come from. Everything that girl did annoyed Luen, as he considered her very irritating. Alt suggested that the most important thing was to focus on the mission and leave that distraction aside. He even proposed that, since Luen was wielding blunt weapons, he should be at the front. Meanwhile, Silas and Ariel would cover the rear. By the way, he asked what type of magic Ariel usually used, which caught her by surprise and she couldn't quite understand the question. He apologized for the confusion. His inquiry had been vague, but he knew there were different types of magic. Some mages created potions, others summoned creatures, and there were even necromancers. She gave as an example Miss Veronica, who specialized in enhancement magic and played a support role, as she had never worked with offensive mages. Perhaps the question had seemed silly, but the mage assured him it was not. Suddenly, an arrow flew toward her and almost hit her, but at that exact moment, the main character caught it in midair. Alt found this action very strange, and Silas looked up in surprise. The attackers were goblins who had ambushed them. The expression on our protagonist's face became serious, and Brian was surprised, as it was clear that this was an goblin ambush. He wanted to intervene, but Maria extended her hand and told him not to advance, that it was better to let this group of weaklings fight for themselves, to assess their worth. An extremely ugly goblin charged at them, but our protagonist struck it with his staff. Up to that moment, everything seemed simple, Luen thought, but then he heard a noise and saw other goblins lying on the ground. Thanks to 2 arrows shot by Silas and Alt's help, who had also defeated more monsters, they managed to control the situation. He did not expect his companions to react so quickly, and he was impressed. Silas commented that it was very strange for goblins to set up an ambush, since they usually act chaotically, always attacking the weakest, such as children or the elderly, first. However, this time the goblins had tried to shoot an arrow at Ariel. When he looked back, he realized that the other group remained very calm, simply observing them carefully. Luen believed they should have kept one goblin alive to interrogate it and get answers. At that moment, everyone was stunned. Even Ariel, who insisted they should use a goblin to locate the nest, was surprised. Even Maria, so confident, had her eyes wide open, alarmed by what was happening. And right behind the protagonist, there was a monstrous creature. But it was not just any monster. It was a huge troll that looked ready to attack at any moment. Alt shouted urgently, ordering Luen to flee from there. Our great friend looked back and realized that the beast was already preparing to strike him. At that very moment, Maria acted bravely, protecting our hero. The little one, despite her size, demonstrated admirable courage. She stepped into the danger to save them. Undoubtedly, that young girl had a commanding personality. Both were surprised by her unexpected intervention, and Luen, worried, asked if she was all right. Shortly after, Brian touched his shoulder, indicating for him to move away so the group could deal with the enemy. Luen remained silent, understanding the seriousness of the situation. He knew that this troll, a creature native to the Rocky Mountains, dwelled in the nearby demon realms. Its presence in the region was strange, but Brian's team decided to face the monster without hesitation. Maria warned that no one should let their guard down, as this was a formidable opponent who would not yield easily. Luen suggested that he join the battle as well, though Alt expressed that it was not advisable. He argued that his involvement might hinder the fight, as he knew the troll's strength, but he trusted the team's experience, which always fought in perfect coordination. That's why he insisted they should rely on them without doubt. Our protagonist nodded, and as he looked at Ariel, he saw that she was also silently observing, attentive to every movement. Brian ordered Veronica to prepare a spell, and she began to conjure an increase in her combat spirit. The young girl managed to boost the skills of the entire group, which surprised Alt, since she was able to strengthen everyone in that moment. Just then, the monster leapt fiercely at Maria, launching a direct attack. The girl, with bravery, faced the assault and managed to block it with her shield, though she felt the pressure of the charge. The troll ended up right in front of them, and the dwarf prepared to shoot. At the same time, Brian loaded a special arrow and fired a precise shot into the creature's eye, creating an opening to attack. Maria told him to get ready, and Brian jumped onto her shield, engaging in combat alongside her. Thus, he faced the troll directly and skillfully drove his dagger into its eyes, blinding the beast in both. Luen was amazed at the team's coordination, which seemed to act as if they had a single body, a truly well-trained formation. After the attack, Brian fell to the ground, but with his vision obscured, the enemy was at a clear disadvantage. Troll regeneration was swift, so they needed to take advantage of that weakness as soon as possible. Maria suggested aiming directly at the monster's heart to stop it permanently, as that would halt its rapid recovery. The group of noble oppressors, known for their excellent coordination and strategic position, remained steadfast in their confrontation. Victory would require precision and teamwork, and they trusted that, with their unity, they could defeat the monster and emerge victorious. But they had a weakness. They lacked significant offensive power. For example, the dwarf carried only a crossbow, and Brian had only small-bladed daggers. Veronica was the only mage in the group, though her role was supportive without attack abilities. Maria, who acted on the front line, carried a spear designed mainly for use from horseback. When she placed the spear on a horse, she could better exploit its offensive potential. To compensate for this deficiency, they devised a secret tactic. Veronica boosted their strength, speed, stamina, and also the power of the weapon, preparing to enhance Maria so she could deliver a decisive strike against the troll. At that moment, Maria charged like lightning. Celis and Ariel watched the entire scene attentively. Thanks to this coordination, they became known as the Golden Unicorn Guild. The troll, at that moment, realized it would be attacked and, unable to avoid it, received the full impact. Maria's small smile and the expressions of the two boys showed that she had pierced the monster easily. With a laugh, she claimed that a giant troll was nothing for her. However, the effort to increase her strength had consequences. She began to spit blood. Alt was worried about Maria, while Brian ran to help his lady. He had warned that this method required great physical effort, but she had stated that, as a noble, she had to set an example for the others. The situation was becoming critical, and the plan was to retreat and call for reinforcements. But Maria was struck by a projectile. Brian saw her fall right in front of him. An arrow pierced her, seemingly poisoned, and she soon began to weaken rapidly. In front of them, a dense forest stretched out, filled with dangerous creatures. Several goblins and giant trolls emerged from within, and Brian understood that this mission far exceeded their experience level. They were completely surrounded. At that moment, Alt realized they should have called for reinforcements, and Maria cried out Veronica's name. The support mage asked what she wanted, and Maria ordered her to evacuate everyone as quickly as possible, because she would try to delay the enemies to give them a chance to escape. Aaron disagreed, and Brian also insisted that they should not follow that option. Maria, with her spear in hand, reminded them that a noble must sacrifice himself for others. The noblewoman did not change her mind, despite the desperate situation. Just then, a character appeared claiming that all this dramatism was unnecessary, and even commented that there was a limit to how much he despised others. With a baseball bat in his hands, he asked if they really thought they could run away. The expressions of those present filled with fear, in the face of the unexpected presence that seemed ready to face everyone alone. Meanwhile, Ariel watched everything silently, without saying a word. At that moment, Celis seemed even more in love. The blonde girl asked the young man to stop being stubborn and assured that this scrap metal weapon couldn't harm anyone, since they were facing giant trolls. However, our big friend stated that when he fought alongside Ares, they faced even more powerful monsters. The girl didn't believe him and demanded that he stop lying. Just then, a troll appears behind her, ready to attack. She screams in desperation, but our protagonist steps forward to protect her. With a strike of his staff, the monster is destroyed, leaving everyone astonished at the boy's strength. The troll, in agony, screams in pain and confesses that he knows very well that she is a seasoned hunter. He even asks her what her plan is and points out that everyone was waiting for her signal. Alt promises not to leave Maria, and all the others express their commitment to fight until the end, regardless of the costs. At that moment, she realizes she has true friends by her side and shows a smile. Then, she devises a strategy. Brian and Celissa should first eliminate the goblins, while the rest of the group handles the jumpers. She notices that Luen has a very powerful damage with his staff and orders him to go to the front. But Ariel approaches and claims that she alone can do all this. The community asks if she has a plan, and with a small laugh she confirms. She recalls that Alt had asked her earlier what kind of magic she possessed, and she tells them she didn't answer because she doesn't have a specific magic, as in this world there is no magic she cannot use. At that moment, her mana increases, enabling Veronica to recover her energy. Then, she activates elemental magic. A glow of fire begins to surround her staff. These are the flames of the rising dragon. Suddenly, a gigantic blaze falls from the sky, sweeping away all the monsters. The strength she showed exceeded all expectations. Meanwhile, our hero simply observes everything silently. Wow, what a powerful woman! She even destroyed the entire forest. She was gathering aura and, suddenly, turns around with a charming smile. She says the mission is accomplished and, after that, steps onto the ground. Maria can barely speak due to the venom and ends up falling heavily to the ground. Brian, worried, starts shouting her name. That lethal substance almost killed her, but they managed to take her to the nearest town. They managed to extract the arrows, and the doctor says she must rest. Luen expresses his hope that Maria recovers soon. Ariel, for her part, seems a bit uneasy, watching everything carefully. Then they ask why she doesn't live in a mansion, since she insists on claiming to be noble. Aram explains that Maria no longer has that status. The boy quickly wants to clarify. Oh, really? What exactly happened? I heard everyone call her my lady. Iron adds that Maria was actually born noble and Brian was her main companion, but all of that is in the past. The scene shifts back to a young Brian, captured by knights and being transported with other bandits to an unknown place. One of the soldiers notices the boy's expression and asks why he always looks so stern, but Brian doesn't answer. Unconcerned, the bandit accompanying him assures that it doesn't matter. He's just unhappy because he's going to be executed anyway. The knights stop at a certain point and comment that transporting such a load in the cart would be a waste of resources. One of them remarks that these bandits are petty thieves, and at that moment, a soldier is hit by a projectile. The man screams in pain, revealing they have been ambushed by a recent army soldiers, who start firing arrows at them. From above, the commander observes the situation, and by the time he arrives, all the soldiers have been defeated. One of the knights calls out to the Lord and asks what to do with the 3 prisoners. The commander decides that since they are criminals, they should be executed right there. Although the prisoners are terrified, Brian shows no emotion and remains still. The commander approaches, examines his face, and removing his helmet, asks, "What are your crimes?" A man begins to shout that they are only looking for bodies on the battlefield, and after he finishes, the commander beheads him mercilessly. The old man seems to have completely lost his patience. Another bandit is terrified, but Brian remains impassive. The commander comments that it seems that this red-haired boy has lost all will to live and wonders if he has forgotten his own courage for life. Since Brian doesn't answer, a young woman next to him asks what his crime is. At that moment, Brian simply looks at her and says that if he's to be executed, the man should quickly cut off his head. Perhaps out of fear, he didn't want to kill a child without reason. The commander laughs at Brian and comments that he liked his brave attitude. Without drawing his sword, he orders them to take him to accompany his youngest daughter and tells his men to place him in the cart. The commander's son understands the order and ends up placing Brian, as if he were a slave, inside the house. Upon arrival, they give him a bathtub filled with hot water to relax, as he seemed to lack hygienic habits. After the bath, a servant comments that he smells bad. After a restorative bath and getting rid of his dirty, stinky clothes, he submerged himself again in the tub, thinking with some disdain, "What kind of slave am I?" he wondered, lamenting the little dignity of his situation. Soon after, one of the soldiers warned him not to behave disrespectfully towards the young girl and made it clear that if he tried to do anything foolish, he would end up dead. The monotony of the moment bored him, and it was at that instant that Maria began to descend the stairs. The little girl, still full of joy from her father's gift, approached him and sternly commented that his appearance was quite disheveled and that he needed to behave with more elegance. Barely seconds had passed since he saw her for the first time, and she already seemed annoyed by him, but instead, she began to act kindly, assuring him he would be treated with affection. Days went by and he always stayed close to the girl, although he did not like his original name, Jared. She insisted that he should choose a name that sounded more intelligent. After much thought, he decided to name him Brian, a name that seemed ridiculous to him but that she had chosen enthusiastically. At that moment, she extended her hand and told him he could count on her for anything he needed, an attitude that struck him as strange for a young girl with a slave. However, over time, he adapted to life in the mansion. He left behind the streets where he used to steal and began doing household chores, making friends with the staff and enjoying good food every day. Instead of being rejected, he earned the respect and affection of some of the internal staff, even Maria herself, who soon seemed to consider him a close friend. After a few months, his desire to keep living slowly returned. While helping the maid outside, she asked if he was okay. With his head down, he replied that he had no reason to complain, but she observed him silently and suddenly touched his forehead, saying he always looked better with his forehead uncovered. This made him blush. He assured her he didn't mind the haircut, but his reddened face betrayed his discomfort. At that moment, someone called Brian, and upon going up the stairs, he asked what Maria wanted. The girl, acting capriciously, said she wanted to eat sweets, but her mother explained that it was not advisable, although she insisted and managed to persuade him with a sad expression. In the kitchen, Brian brought her some candies, which she devoured with a very adorable face. The girl commented that she knew he was the perfect boy for that role, recognizing in him certain skills acquired in his past. such as those of someone who was a bandit, skilled in stealing. However, it seemed he didn't like to talk much about that past or those abilities. Over time, he realized that Maria had grown up and become a beautiful and kind young woman. He mentioned that his father was already arriving. At that very moment, he had returned home. His wife greeted him after several months away on military duty. At that instant, the girl ran out calling for her mother and quickly headed toward her father. They embraced affectionately, and the man couldn't take his eyes off Brian, who always behaved respectfully. Soon, the girl's brothers appeared, and she was very happy to see them again. She hadn't seen her two older brothers, Leon, the eldest, and Reynold, the second, for quite some time. Together, they played with the little girl, and one of them thanked Brian for taking care of his sister, which slightly surprised the young man. Then, the father called the whole family to the table for lunch, and everyone enjoyed a delicious meal together. The girl regained her joy being with her father and brothers, and the evening was very comforting. Just seeing that happy family, Brian already felt a deep happiness in his heart. Later, while clearing the dishes, his lord called him for an important conversation. They sat outside, and the gentleman confessed that he had brought Brian into his home 5 years ago. He asked how he felt, and the young man responded happily, saying he couldn't ask for more. He mentioned that he was living well, and his master laughed, noting that it showed on his face. When he had taken him in half a decade ago, Brian didn't feel like living. Now, he attributed everything to the Lord, who had restored his desire to go on. The man looked at him carefully and told him that his life now belonged to him, even asking if he would be willing to give it for him. Near the mansion, a horse appeared, and it was seen that an army approached the master's estate, seemingly preparing for an attack. The elderly man with a mustache ordered to advance, and they moved toward Maria's mansion. Thus, we conclude the first part of this story. Many thanks to those who read this far. To show that you are a true follower, simply comment, "The Bat Hunter." This work is very good. I didn't expect much, but I liked it quite a lot. If you're interested and we reach the goal as more chapters come out, I will quickly bring you a continuation. Thanks to everyone who leaves comments. Without your support, this channel wouldn't exist. As a recommendation, I share 2 videos from a channel you will surely enjoy. They are high-quality productions, but YouTube didn't recommend them, so you probably haven't seen them yet. It's worth noting that many viewers of these contents are not subscribed to the channel, so it would be convenient to do so. We will meet in the next installment. Until then, thank you very much and see you soon.